Sometimes the loneliest person in the room is the woman pretending she's okay for everyone else. Emily Carter stood outside the grand ballroom of the Magnolia Grand Hotel for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the glowing crystal chandeliers through the glass entrance doors, while guests in elegant tuxedos and flowing evening gowns laughed inside like they belonged in another world. Her fingers tightened around the small silver purse hanging from her wrist as a cold November wind brushed against her pale blue dress, the same dress she had worn 2 years ago to a church fundraiser, because buying a new one simply wasn't possible right now. Beside her, 6-year-old Sophie held her hand with both of hers, looking up with wide, innocent eyes that always seemed to notice things adults tried to hide. "Mom," Sophie whispered softly, tugging on her sleeve. "You look pretty tonight." Emily swallowed hard the moment those words hit her chest, because nobody had said something like that to her in a very long time. Not after the divorce. Not after the endless overtime shifts at the diner. Not after learning how invisible a woman could become once people saw the words single mother attached to her name. She forced a smile anyway, brushing a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear before kneeling slightly in front of her daughter. "You really think so?" Sophie nodded immediately. "You look like a princess." Emily laughed quietly, though it almost broke in the middle. "A princess with discount heels." Sophie giggled, and for one tiny moment, the knot in Emily's chest loosened enough for her to breathe again. But the second the ballroom doors opened and another wealthy couple walked inside, without even glancing at her, reality returned fast. Tonight was her cousin Vanessa's wedding, the kind people in their family would talk about for years. Luxury flowers imported from Italy, a string quartet from Chicago, a 5-tier cake that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent. And every relative inside already knew she was arriving alone. Again, she could already imagine the looks, the whispers, the carefully disguised pity hiding behind fake smiles. "Where's your husband now, Emily? Still working at that diner? Must be hard raising a kid by yourself." She almost turned around. Honestly, she wanted to. Nothing about this night felt safe for her heart. But then she remembered her grandmother calling 3 weeks ago in that fragile voice weakened by age and illness. "Please come, sweetheart," her grandmother had said. Families shouldn't disappear from each other after hard times. Emily couldn't say no to her. Not to the woman who used to slip $20 bills into her backpack when she was a teenager because she knew Emily skipped lunch to save money. So despite every instinct screaming at her to leave, Emily finally inhaled slowly and reached for the ballroom door. The warm air inside smelled like roses, champagne, and expensive perfume. The laughter became louder instantly. Crystal lights shimmered across polished marble floors while photographers moved around capturing perfect moments between perfect people. Emily immediately felt underdressed, underqualified, unwanted. Sophie squeezed her hand tighter as guests passed them without recognition until Emily noticed the seating chart near the entrance. She searched for her name carefully, hoping maybe there had been a mistake. But there it was. Emily Carter. Table 17. Her stomach dropped when she realized Table 17 sat all the way near the back corner of the ballroom beside the kitchen doors, far from family, far from the dance floor, far from everyone who mattered. And somehow, that hurt more than she expected. Emily stared at the tiny printed card for several silent seconds before forcing herself to smile again for Sophie's sake. But deep down, she suddenly understood something painful. Tonight wasn't just a wedding invitation. It was a reminder of exactly where the world believed she belonged. People can tell you exactly how they see your worth without saying a single cruel word. Emily kept her smile in place as she guided Sophie through the crowded ballroom, pretending the long walk toward Table 17 did not feel like a public announcement of failure. Every elegant centerpiece they passed seemed brighter than the last, overflowing with white roses and gold candles that reflected across crystal glasses like tiny stars. Closer to the dance floor, guests laughed loudly beneath warm lights, while waiters carried trays of champagne and lobster appetizers through clusters of wealthy relatives and business associates dressed in designer suits Emily could never afford even after months of overtime shifts. But the farther she walked toward the back corner of the room, the dimmer everything became. By the time they reached Table 17, the music sounded distant, almost muffled beneath the constant swing of the kitchen doors nearby. Emily glanced around slowly. The table was smaller than the others, tucked beside a service hallway where waiters rushed in and out carrying dirty plates. Half the seats were empty. One older couple barely looked up from their drinks when she arrived. Another guest checked his phone without acknowledging her existence at all. Sophie climbed carefully into her chair and whispered, "Why are we sitting all the way back here?" Emily forced another gentle smile. "Because these seats are quieter." Sophie tilted her head slightly, unconvinced but too sweet to argue. Emily sat down and adjusted the wrinkles in her dress beneath the table, suddenly aware that the zipper at the side had started slipping again. She discreetly pulled it higher while nearby laughter echoed from the center of the ballroom, where the important guests sat close to Vanessa and her new husband. Emily recognized almost everyone at those front tables. Her cousins, her aunts, people who used to invite her to vacations and Christmas dinners before her divorce quietly turned her into the uncomfortable family story nobody wanted near happiness. She tried not to stare, but then she noticed her younger cousin Rachel whispering something to another bridesmaid while glancing toward her table. Both women immediately looked away after making eye contact with Emily. That familiar heat of embarrassment crawled slowly up her neck. Sophie reached for a dinner roll from the bread basket and accidentally dropped her napkin beneath the table. Emily bent down quickly to grab it just as a pair of expensive black heels stopped beside her chair. "Emily," a woman's voice said with obvious surprise. Emily looked up and instantly recognized Aunt Diane, wearing diamonds around her neck large enough to catch the ballroom lights. "Oh my goodness," Diane said, offering a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "I almost did not recognize you." Emily stood politely. "Hi, Aunt Diane." Diane's gaze shifted briefly towards Sophie before returning to Emily's worn dress. "I heard you were still working at that diner outside Greenville." "Yes," Emily answered softly. "Part-time and weekends." "Well," Diane replied while sipping champagne, "life certainly takes people in different directions." Emily felt the sting beneath the sentence immediately. Diane leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice even though several nearby guests could still hear. "It must be difficult coming to events like this alone." Before Emily could answer, Sophie looked up innocently and asked, "Why is being alone bad?" Diane blinked awkwardly for half a second before laughing quietly. "Oh, sweetheart, it is not bad." But her expression said otherwise. Emily gently rubbed Sophie's shoulder, trying to end the conversation quickly. "We are doing just fine." Diane smiled again, the same polished smile wealthy people used when they wanted to appear kind without actually being kind at all. "Of course you are." Then her eyes drifted across the ballroom toward the glowing center tables. "Still, weddings can remind people of what they lost." Emily stopped breathing for a moment after hearing that sentence because Diane did not even try to hide the meaning anymore. And somehow the worst part was not the humiliation itself. It was realizing everyone nearby had heard it and nobody said a word. The people who notice pain the fastest are usually the ones who have lived through it themselves. Emily lowered her eyes toward the table after Aunt Diane walked away, pretending to straighten Sophie's tiny white cardigan so nobody would notice how badly her hands were trembling. Around her, conversations resumed almost immediately, as if humiliation had become just another background sound beneath the wedding music. The older couple beside her quietly exchanged looks before returning to their drinks, careful not to involve themselves. Emily felt heat rising into her cheeks while Sophie stared at her with confusion, too young to fully understand cruelty, but old enough to feel its weight. "Mom," Sophie whispered carefully, "did we do something wrong?" Emily's heart cracked a little at the question. She immediately shook her head and forced softness into her voice. "No, baby. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind." Sophie nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. Emily reached for her water glass, desperate for something to steady herself. But before she could take a sip, applause suddenly filled the ballroom as the bride and groom entered for their first dance. Every head turned toward the glowing center of the room while lights dimmed above the guests. Emily watched silently as Vanessa smiled beneath sparkling chandeliers, surrounded by admiration and camera flashes. Once upon a time, Emily thought her own wedding would feel like that forever. Safe, promising, permanent. Instead, she ended up learning how quickly dreams could disappear after unpaid bills, broken promises, and silence replaced love inside a marriage. She pushed the thought away before it could pull her under completely. Near the front of the ballroom, waiters hurried to refill champagne glasses while guests leaned toward each other whispering excitedly. But high above the celebration, behind the second-floor balcony overlooking the dance floor, another pair of eyes had been quietly watching table 17 for the last several minutes. Alexander Hayes stood near the balcony railing with one hand resting inside the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, while executives and investors around him discussed hotel acquisitions he barely listened to anymore. The Magnolia Grand belonged to his company. Technically, tonight he was only there as a favor to one of Vanessa's father's business partners. Normally, Alexander avoided weddings entirely. Too much pretending. Too many polished smiles hiding empty lives. But then he noticed her. Not because she was loud. Not because she was glamorous. The exact opposite. She looked like someone trying desperately not to take up space in a room, determined to remind her she did not belong there. Alexander watched Emily smile for her daughter even after being publicly embarrassed by an older woman dripping in diamonds. Most people in that situation would either lash out or leave. She did neither. Instead, she comforted her child first. Something about that unsettled him more than he expected. One of the executives beside him laughed while checking his watch. Another wedding, another overpriced speech. Alexander barely responded. His attention stayed fixed on the back corner near the kitchen doors where Emily quietly cut Sophie's chicken into smaller pieces before pretending to eat her own untouched meal. Sophisticated guests filled the ballroom in custom suits and $1,000 dresses. Yet somehow the most genuine person in the room sat alone beside a service hallway. Then Sophie accidentally knocked over her glass of apple juice. The drink spilled across the tablecloth and dripped onto Emily's dress instantly. Emily apologized to everyone at the table before anyone even reacted. "I am so sorry," she said quickly while grabbing napkins. Sophie's face turned pale with panic. "I did not mean to, Mommy." "It is okay," Emily whispered immediately, though exhaustion had started creeping into her voice. One guest sighed dramatically while moving her purse farther from the spill. Another muttered something under his breath about children at formal events. Emily knelt beside Sophie, trying to calm her down while cleaning the mess alone because nobody else offered to help. Above them, Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. Then, without saying a word to the executives around him, he set down his untouched glass of whiskey and started walking toward the staircase leading directly to the ballroom floor. Sometimes a single moment changes because one person finally decides you deserve better. Emily kept apologizing while blotting apple juice from the tablecloth with trembling napkins even though the spill had barely touched anyone else. Sophie looked seconds away from crying. Her tiny shoulders curled inward beneath her cardigan as nearby guests avoided eye contact with the uncomfortable scene. "I said I am sorry," Sophie whispered again, almost too quietly to hear. The woman beside them sighed dramatically while lifting her designer purse higher onto her lap. "This is why children usually stay home during formal receptions," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Emily to hear every word. Emily's stomach tightened instantly. "She is only 6. Emily replied softly while trying to protect Sophie from the embarrassment growing around them. "And accidents happen." The woman only shrugged before returning to her wine glass. Emily inhaled slowly, fighting the sting behind her eyes. She refused to cry here. Not in front of strangers. Not in front of Sophie. She reached for another napkin just as a calm masculine voice spoke behind her. "You missed a spot." Emily turned in surprise. A tall man stood beside the table holding a folded white handkerchief in one hand. For a second, she forgot how to breathe properly. He looked completely out of place near table 17. His charcoal suit fit perfectly against broad shoulders, the kind tailored specifically for men who never had to think about prices. Dark blonde hair framed sharp features, softened only slightly by thoughtful gray eyes focused entirely on Sophie instead of the spilled drink. Without waiting for permission, he crouched beside the table and handed the handkerchief to Sophie directly. "Here," he said gently. "This works better than paper napkins." Sophie stared at him with wide, nervous eyes. "I am sorry." "For what?" he asked calmly. "You spilled juice. You did not rob a bank." Sophie blinked in surprise before a tiny smile finally appeared on her face. Emily almost smiled too. "Almost. Thank you," she said cautiously while accepting the handkerchief. "You really do not have to help." "I know." His voice stayed calm and low, but there was something steady about it that immediately quieted the tension around the table. Nearby conversations had already started slowing as guests subtly noticed the unfamiliar man standing beside Emily. The older couple beside her straightened slightly in their seats. Even the rude woman with the purse suddenly looked uncomfortable. The stranger glanced briefly at the empty chair beside Emily before looking back at her. "May I?" Emily hesitated for half a second before nodding politely. The man sat down beside her with effortless confidence, as though he belonged anywhere he chose to sit. Sophie kept staring at him curiously while Emily became painfully aware of how close he was. Expensive cologne, clean watch, calm posture. Nothing about him fit into her world. "You seem uncomfortable," he said quietly without looking at her directly. Emily let out a small nervous laugh. "Is it that obvious?" Only to people paying attention. Something about the answer unsettled her because it sounded honest instead of flirtatious. Emily glanced around the ballroom nervously. Several guests were openly staring now. "I think people are wondering if you are lost," she joked weakly. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I was thinking the same thing about you." Before Emily could answer, Aunt Diane suddenly appeared again near the table holding another glass of champagne. This time, however, the moment she noticed the man sitting beside Emily, her entire expression changed. "Oh," Diane said quickly, blinking in confusion. "I did not realize you were with someone." Emily opened her mouth to explain, but before she could speak, the man calmly rested one arm along the back of her chair and looked directly at Diane with composed confidence. "She is," he said simply. Silence hit the table instantly. Emily froze. Sophie looked between them with complete confusion. Aunt Diane's eyes widened slightly as recognition slowly crossed her face. The man leaned closer toward Emily then, close enough for only her to hear his next words. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Pretend I am your husband tonight." Nothing confuses cruel people more than watching someone they dismissed suddenly become important. Emily stared at the man beside her, convinced for one impossible second that she had misunderstood what he whispered. "Pretend I am your husband tonight." The sentence echoed through her mind while the ballroom noise around them seemed to fade into distant static. Aunt Diane still stood frozen beside the table, gripping her champagne glass tighter as recognition finally settled across her face. "Alexander Hayes," Diane said carefully, almost breathless now. "I did not realize you were attending tonight." Emily's eyes widened instantly at the name. Even she recognized it. Alexander Hayes was not just wealthy. He was the Alexander Hayes, owner of luxury hotels across the country. Business magazines called him one of the most influential entrepreneurs in America under 40. Emily suddenly felt even more disoriented than before. Why would a man like this be sitting beside her at table 17? Alexander nodded politely toward Diane without removing his arm from the back of Emily's chair. "Good evening." Diane's entire posture transformed within seconds. Her cold superiority disappeared so quickly it almost felt unreal. "Well," she laughed nervously, "I had no idea Emily was married." Emily opened her mouth again, panic rising inside her chest, but Alexander answered smoothly before she could speak. "We prefer to keep our private life quiet." The lie landed perfectly. Diane blinked several times before forcing another smile, this one dramatically softer than earlier. "Of course, that makes sense." Then she glanced toward Emily with completely different eyes now, no longer dismissive but cautious. Respectful even. And Emily hated how much that hurt, because nothing about her had changed in the last 5 minutes except the man sitting beside her. Diane suddenly leaned closer toward Sophie. "Sweetheart, would you like some cake? I can ask the staff to bring you extra strawberries." Sophie looked confused by the sudden kindness, but nodded shyly anyway. "Okay. Wonderful," Diane replied brightly before turning back to Alexander. "Please let me know if either of you need anything tonight." Then she walked away quickly, heels clicking across the ballroom floor, as if escaping embarrassment herself now. Emily watched her disappear into the crowd before finally turning toward Alexander again. "Why would you say that?" she whispered urgently. Alexander remained calm. "Because people like her only understand power." Emily shook her head slightly. "You do not even know me." "No," he replied quietly, "but I know humiliation when I see it." Something about the answer silenced her instantly. Across the ballroom, whispers had already started spreading. Guests subtly turned their heads toward table 17 while pretending not to stare. A bridesmaid near the dance floor nearly dropped her champagne flute after spotting Alexander sitting beside Emily. Even the waitstaff suddenly moved differently around them. Within minutes, a server appeared carrying fresh drinks and a new linen tablecloth for the spill. Another employee brought Sophie a small plate of chocolate-covered strawberries without being asked. Emily almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. 30 minutes ago, she felt invisible. Now people could not stop watching her. Sophie leaned closer to Emily and whispered loudly enough for Alexander to hear. "Mom, is he famous?" Alexander looked at Sophie with the first genuine smile Emily had seen from him yet. "Only on stressful days." Sophie giggled softly. Then the wedding coordinator herself suddenly rushed toward their table looking pale with panic. "Mr. Hayes," she said quickly, "we had no idea you were seated back here. There has clearly been a mistake." Emily immediately understood what was happening next even before the woman continued. "We prepared a private VIP table near the dance floor for our honored guests. We would be happy to move you immediately." The entire table fell silent. Several nearby guests openly stared now. Emily's pulse quickened with embarrassment all over again, except this time for completely different reasons. She expected Alexander to stand and leave without hesitation. Men like him belonged at the front of rooms like this. But instead, he looked directly at Emily before answering. "Only if my wife is comfortable with it." The word wife hit her chest so unexpectedly that for a second she forgot this entire thing was supposed to be pretend. The most dangerous thing about kindness is how quickly a hurting heart can start depending on it. Emily felt every pair of eyes in the ballroom watching her as the wedding coordinator waited nervously for an answer. Her pulse pounded so loudly she could barely hear the music anymore. Across the room, relatives who had ignored her all night now stared openly with confusion and curiosity. She knew exactly what they were thinking. How could someone like Emily Carter possibly be connected to Alexander Hayes? The question hung silently in the air around every chandelier and champagne glass inside the ballroom. Emily instinctively looked toward Alexander, expecting him to end the charade before things became even more unbelievable. But his expression remained calm, almost unreadable. He was giving her the choice. Somehow that made everything feel more dangerous. Sophie looked up excitedly from her chair. "Mom, can we sit near the dancing?" Emily swallowed hard before answering quietly. "I guess that would be okay." Relief instantly spread across the coordinator's face. "Wonderful. Right this way." Within minutes, waiters began clearing their table, while several guests nearby suddenly smiled at Emily as if they had known her forever. One man even pulled out her chair politely, while another offered Sophie extra dessert options. The transformation was so immediate, it almost made Emily sick to her stomach. Earlier, they treated her like a burden beside the kitchen doors. Now they acted like she belonged among the most important people in the room. And all because a powerful man sat beside her. As they crossed the ballroom toward the VIP section, conversations lowered around them in waves. Emily kept her eyes forward while Sophie happily held her hand on one side and Alexander walked beside her on the other. It felt strangely convincing. Too convincing. The new table sat near the center of the ballroom beneath soft golden lights with a perfect view of the dance floor. Crystal glasses sparkled beside polished silverware while fresh roses filled the centerpiece. This was the kind of table Emily imagined wealthy families fought over during weddings. Yet somehow she had been invited there only because Alexander decided she deserved protection for one evening. Once they sat down, Sophie immediately leaned closer to the dance floor, fascinated by the music and lights. "This is beautiful," she whispered. Emily quietly agreed. Alexander watched her for a moment before speaking. "You still look uncomfortable." Emily let out a soft, nervous laugh. "That obvious too?" "Yes." His honesty caught her off guard again. Emily stared down at the untouched wine beside her. "I just do not understand why you are doing this." Alexander rested one hand loosely against the table. "Because nobody stepped in for my mother either." Emily looked up slowly. For the first time all evening, something shifted in his voice. Not weakness exactly. Something older. He glanced briefly across the ballroom before continuing quietly. She spent most of her life being underestimated by people with money. People who thought struggling meant she deserved less respect. Emily stayed silent. Alexander's gaze moved towards Sophie. Women trying to hold everything together alone become invisible to certain kinds of people. Emily felt her chest tighten unexpectedly because those words sounded too accurate to ignore. Nobody had ever described her life so simply before. A waiter approached to refill their glasses, smiling nervously at Alexander before disappearing again. Emily shook her head slightly in disbelief after he left. This entire room changes around you. Alexander barely reacted. Money changes people faster than honesty ever will. Sophie suddenly tugged gently on his sleeve. Mr. Alexander? Yes. Are you really my mom's husband tonight? Emily nearly choked on her water, while Alexander looked completely unfazed. Only if your mom allows it. Sophie studied him seriously for several seconds before nodding once like she had made an important decision. Okay, I like you better than my real dad already. Silence settled instantly across the table. Emily's face drained of color. Sophie, she whispered softly, embarrassed. That is not polite. But Alexander did not look offended. If anything, something painful flickered briefly behind his eyes before disappearing again. Then he leaned slightly closer toward Emily and lowered his voice enough that only she could hear him. Whatever happened to you, he said quietly. I am guessing you spent years surviving it alone. Some people survive heartbreak so long they forget what it feels like when someone finally notices their pain. Emily could not answer Alexander right away. The softness in his voice unsettled her more than his wealth ever could because it sounded less like curiosity and more like recognition. Around them, the wedding continued in sparkling perfection. Laughter echoed across the ballroom, while couples danced beneath golden lights and photographers captured memories people would frame for years. But at their table, something quieter had settled between them, something unexpectedly honest. Emily looked down at her hands resting in her lap. You get used to surviving alone after a while, she admitted softly. At first you think somebody will come help you carry everything. Then eventually you realize nobody is coming. Alexander listened without interrupting. Most people interrupted. Most people rushed to give advice or uncomfortable sympathy. But he simply listened, and somehow that made the words easier to say. Emily glanced toward Sophie, who had become distracted by the dance floor again. After my divorce, I worked every shift I could find. Morning diner shifts, weekend catering jobs, cleaning offices twice a week at night after Sophie fell asleep. She laughed quietly without humor. There were months I slept maybe 4 hours a night. Alexander's expression remained calm, but his eyes never left her face. Emily continued before she could stop herself. My ex-husband used to promise things would get better. Better jobs, better finances, better effort. She swallowed carefully. But eventually promises turned into excuses. Then excuses turned into silence. A slow instrumental song drifted through the ballroom speakers while guests nearby clinked champagne glasses together. Emily suddenly felt strangely detached from all of it, like she was talking about someone else's life instead of her own. When Sophie was born, she said quietly, he stayed for about 8 months. Then one day he packed a suitcase and said he needed freedom because fatherhood was too stressful. Alexander's jaw tightened almost invisibly. He left. Emily nodded once. He sends birthday cards sometimes. That is about it. Silence settled between them again. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind created when two people unexpectedly stop pretending. Sophie climbed into her chair again, holding a cupcake almost bigger than her hands. Mommy, look. Emily smiled immediately, grateful for the interruption. That looks delicious. Sophie took a bite before offering the cupcake toward Alexander too. You can have some. Alexander actually smiled this time. A real smile. Thank you, Sophie. Emily watched the interaction carefully, something inside her softening despite herself. Most men she met became uncomfortable around children within minutes. But Alexander spoke to Sophie like she mattered. Like she was not an inconvenience attached to her mother. That alone made Emily dangerously emotional tonight. Alexander looked toward the dance floor before speaking again, his voice quieter now. My mother raised me alone too. Emily blinked in surprise. He rarely sounded personal, but now every word carried weight beneath it. My father came from money, Alexander continued calmly. The kind that teaches people appearances matter more than loyalty. His eyes darkened slightly. When my mother got pregnant, his family made it clear she was not welcome in their world. Emily listened carefully while the ballroom noise faded around them again. She worked 3 jobs most of my childhood, Alexander said. Waitress during the day, grocery store at night, accounting classes in between. He gave a faint, humorless smile. I remember pretending not to notice when she skipped dinner so I could eat more. Emily felt her chest tighten painfully because she understood that kind of sacrifice too well. Alexander glanced briefly toward Sophie. People looked at her the same way they looked at you tonight. Emily stared at him silently. Like struggling made her smaller, he finished quietly. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Sophie suddenly yawned and leaned sleepily against Alexander's arm without hesitation. Emily immediately reached for her. Sophie, honey, do not bother him. But Alexander gently shook his head before Emily could pull her away. She is fine. Sophie rested comfortably against him within seconds, completely trusting a man she had met less than an hour ago. Alexander looked down at the little girl sleeping against his shoulder before lifting his eyes back toward Emily. And for the first time all night, Emily realized something terrifying. This was no longer feeling like pretending anymore. The hardest walls to break are the ones built by disappointment. Emily sat perfectly still as Sophie slept peacefully against Alexander's shoulder, her tiny hand loosely curled against the sleeve of his suit, like she had known him forever instead of less than 2 hours. Around them, the wedding reception had grown louder and warmer as the night continued. Guests danced beneath sparkling chandeliers while waiters carried trays of desserts across the ballroom. But Emily barely noticed any of it anymore. Her attention kept drifting back toward the impossible scene beside her. Alexander Hayes, one of the wealthiest men in the country, sat patiently holding space for a tired little girl who was not even his responsibility. And somehow that simple kindness affected Emily more deeply than grand romantic gestures ever could. Sophie shifted slightly in her sleep, and Alexander instinctively adjusted his posture to keep her comfortable without waking her. The movement was so natural Emily felt an ache rise unexpectedly inside her chest. "You are good with her," Emily said quietly. Alexander glanced down at Sophie before answering. "She is easy to care about." Emily lowered her eyes immediately after hearing that because she had spent years around people who treated her daughter like an inconvenience attached to her life. Babysitters who canceled last minute. Men who lost interest once they realized Emily came with responsibilities bigger than dinner dates and weekend freedom. Even some relatives treated Sophie with polite distance, as though poverty and divorce might somehow be contagious. But Alexander looked at her child with patience instead of discomfort. That difference mattered more than he probably understood. A slow love song drifted softly through the ballroom, while couples moved together across the dance floor. Emily watched them for a moment before letting out a faint, nervous laugh. "This entire night feels unreal." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "That is because nobody usually steps outside the role people assign them." Emily looked toward him carefully. "And what role was assigned to me?" His answer came without hesitation. "The woman people underestimated because life hurt her publicly." Emily swallowed hard. The accuracy of it stung. Alexander's gaze softened slightly. "But struggling is not the same thing as failing." Nobody had ever said those words to her before. Not like that. Not without pity attached to them. Emily looked away quickly because something dangerous was happening inside her chest tonight. Hope. Small, fragile hope. The kind she stopped trusting years ago. She folded her hands together tightly in her lap. "Men like you do not usually notice women like me." The moment the sentence left her mouth, she regretted it. It sounded too honest. Too vulnerable. But Alexander did not look offended. If anything, his expression turned quieter. "Women like you," he repeated softly. Emily laughed under her breath, embarrassed now. "You know what I mean." "No," he replied calmly. "I do not think I do." Emily stared down at the glowing candles on the table. "You belong in rooms like this. I belong at the back table near the kitchen doors." Alexander's eyes stayed fixed on her for several long seconds. "You really believe that?" Emily gave a small shrug, even though the answer hurt. Eventually, people start believing what the world repeats to them long enough. Silence settled between them again, while music floated gently through the ballroom. Then Alexander spoke quietly. "My mother used to say something similar." Emily looked up. What happened to her? For the first time that night, genuine sadness crossed his face openly. "She died when I was 23. Emily's breath caught softly. "I am sorry." Alexander nodded once. She worked herself into exhaustion, trying to prove she deserved respect from people who were never going to give it freely. He looked towards Sophie sleeping peacefully beside him. After she died, I promised myself I would never become the kind of man who ignores suffering just because it is inconvenient. Emily felt tears threatening again and immediately blinked them away. She hated crying in public, hated feeling emotionally exposed. But tonight, every defense she built over the years seemed weaker around him. Across the ballroom, guests continued celebrating beneath warm lights and expensive decorations. Yet somehow the quiet conversation happening at their table felt more real than the entire wedding around them. Then Alexander looked directly at Emily again, his voice lower now, almost careful. "You keep waiting for me to leave." Emily's chest tightened instantly because he was right. Completely right. And the worst part was realizing she had already started hoping he would not. Sometimes the person who changes your life is simply the first one who stays. By the time the wedding reception finally began winding down, the ballroom had softened into quiet conversations, half-empty champagne glasses, and tired guests gathering coats near the exits. Sophie was still asleep against Alexander's shoulder, completely unaware that she had trusted a stranger more easily in one night than Emily had trusted anyone in years. Emily glanced at the large clock above the ballroom entrance and sighed quietly. "I should get her home." Alexander nodded gently before carefully standing with Sophie still asleep in his arms. The movement was so natural that Emily instinctively reached to help him, but Sophie only curled closer against his chest without waking up. Something about seeing her daughter, so peaceful, nearly unraveled Emily emotionally all over again. They walked slowly through the ballroom together while conversations lowered around them once more. Relatives who ignored Emily earlier now smiled warmly as they passed. Several guests even stopped Alexander to shake his hand before politely introducing themselves to Emily like she suddenly mattered too. She noticed it all now. The fake warmth, the instant respect borrowed from his presence. But strangely, it did not hurt as much anymore, because for the first time in years, someone had stood beside her instead of quietly stepping away. Outside the hotel entrance, cold November air swept through the valet lane while city lights reflected against the wet pavement from an earlier rainstorm. Alexander carefully adjusted Sophie in his arms while Emily searched her purse for the parking ticket to her old Toyota sedan parked near the back garage. "You drove here?" Alexander asked calmly after noticing the ticket. Emily laughed softly. "Not everyone arrives in a black car with a driver." A faint smile touched his face. "Fair point." The valet attendant approached nervously. "Mr. Hayes, your car is ready." A sleek black luxury SUV pulled toward the entrance moments later, glowing beneath the hotel lights. Emily looked toward her own aging sedan waiting farther down the lot, and suddenly felt painfully aware of the difference between their worlds again. Earlier inside the ballroom, emotions blurred everything together. But standing here now beneath the cold night air, reality returned. Men like Alexander Hayes did not accidentally become part of ordinary women's lives. Fairy tales were beautiful because they were temporary. Emily reached carefully for Sophie. "I can take her now." But Sophie stirred slightly in her sleep and tightened her tiny arms around Alexander's neck instead. Alexander looked down at her with quiet amusement. "Apparently not." Emily smiled despite herself. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The city noise around them faded beneath the strange warmth lingering between two people who technically still barely knew each other. Then Emily forced herself to step back emotionally before hope could grow any larger inside her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For tonight. You did not have to do any of this." Alexander studied her carefully. "You keep saying that." Emily folded her arms against the cold. "Because it is true." He stepped slightly closer, his voice lower now beneath the distant sounds of traffic and fading wedding music. "Emily, when I walked into that ballroom tonight, everyone saw a single mother sitting alone." His eyes stayed fixed on hers. "I saw a woman carrying an entire life on exhausted shoulders while still protecting her daughter's happiness first." Emily immediately looked away because no one had ever described her with that kind of gentleness before. Alexander continued quietly. "That is not weakness." The cold wind lifted strands of Emily's hair across her face, while emotion tightened painfully in her throat. "People do not stay," she admitted softly before she could stop herself. "Not permanently." Alexander stood silent for a moment after hearing that. Then he carefully transferred Sophie into Emily's arms without waking her. Emily held her daughter close while Alexander looked at both of them beneath the warm hotel lights. Something unspoken passed through the silence between them. Something neither of them seemed ready to name yet. Then Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed Emily a simple black business card with only his name and private number printed across it. "You said people leave," he said quietly. "So let me prove otherwise." Emily stared down at the card in her trembling hand. Her heart warned her not to trust this feeling, not to believe impossible things after one emotional night. But then Alexander stepped closer one final time, his voice almost a whisper now. "Do not pretend anymore, Emily." His eyes held her steadily. "Let someone stay.